Hey, stop running in the church. Get down from there. No climbing on the pews. You ever had anyone say something like that to you? Now, as for me and my brothers, we heard that a few times as we were growing up. After all, kids will be kids. And it reminds me that in the church we have a long-standing tradition of expecting people to show respect for sacred places. There are some things you just don't do in a house of worship because you don't want to be disrespectful to God. I'm sure you remember the story of Moses and the burning bush. One of the first times in the Bible we see this idea of respect for the sacred place. God said to Moses, "You're standing on holy ground. Remove your sandals." I saw a modern-day version of that when I toured South Korea. Went to over a dozen churches, and the tradition in those churches, remove your shoes before you enter the holy sanctuary. It was different, and I enjoyed it. You know, there's a lot of modern traditions today of how to enter a sanctuary and show respect to the holy place. Some of the rules I hear today seem very reasonable. I think reasonable to most people. But some of the rules seem a bit archaic, as if they're out of place, out of time. They raise the question, and why not? Why can't we do that? I think it's good for us to go back to Moses, see if we can learn from Leviticus a little bit more about how to show respect for sacred things. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 30, God says, "Show respect for my sanctuary, because I am the Lord." The word sanctuary refers to a holy place. In that original reference, it was talking about the tabernacle. Later, when they built the temple, they applied the same rule there. Now, Moses created a lot of sanctuary rules, rules for how to be respectful and what not to do, what's disrespectful at God's sanctuary. Now, the rules that Moses created, they made perfect sense back in his day. It fit their situation. But you know, those rules are not binding upon the church. They're part of the Jewish religious rituals that did not carry over into Christianity. Things like priests and sacrifices, holy days, Sabbath day and Sabbath rules, the food code of clean and unclean and such as that. Now, these are the kind of rules Paul says you can use them if you wish, or you can ignore them completely if you prefer. Now, I look at the rules that Moses created for the sanctuary, and a lot of them are not a good fit for the church today. For example, his rules regarding admission. He segregated the Jews from the Gentiles. Gentiles had to stay way out on the peripheral. Jews could come in closer, but still they stayed out in the courtyard. Or priests, only ones who could actually go into the sanctuary, into that first room, the holy place. The inner chamber, nobody could go except the high priest once a year. Now, rules that separate people and tell them where you can sit back here versus up there doesn't really fit the church very well today. He also had rules about the ceremonially unclean. People who were unclean in a ritual way cannot come into the sanctuary area. So if you're a mother, you just gave birth to a child, stay away. Your monthly menstrual period, stay away. You and your family went to a funeral, stay away. And I look at that and think, the modern church, we don't want people to stay away. We want them to come. And then there were other rules that you'll find, separating men from the women. Rules about no touching. Can't touch this or can't touch that, like the Ark of the Covenant. And then the penalties. Expulsion from the community or death if you disrespected the sanctuary. You know, Christians have created their own traditions, their own rules for how to show respect in a sanctuary, in a holy place. Now keep in mind, those are traditions that we created. In the New Testament, we weren't given any rules for sanctuary. And in the early church, no rules for sanctuary. And you know why not? They didn't have special buildings. They didn't have a special sanctuary. They had to create a holy space wherever they could. They met in homes. They met in rented spaces. They met outdoors. They met in the catacombs. And during the time they were there, they made those a holy place. Now, their lack of rules for such things doesn't mean they had a lack of respect. The principle of respect for sacred things was always there. Anything that represents God, you treat it with respect. You handle it with care, lest you show disrespect to God. But how they applied that principle in their situation, it may vary from what we do today. You see, I think it's still appropriate today to show respect for holy places, for places that represent God's presence. It's an idea that we learned from Leviticus, But we've got to figure out how to apply it in our modern church. You think about the tabernacle, it was a fancy tent in a city of tents, but it was a special tent. It symbolized, it represented God's presence. They treated it with respect. Let's do the same with our sacred places. An abiding principle, but it has to be applied to changing times and circumstances. Let me give you some suggestions. If you're dealing with a permanent structure, this would be a building which has a sanctuary space that is dedicated use for worship. Then I recommend you treat that space with great respect when you're gathering for worship. Or if you're touring and sightseeing some of the great church buildings around, show respect for the facility and for the space as you enter it. Now, what about temporary sanctuaries? That's where you've got a space that is temporarily being used for worship, like the early church often had to do. What I recommend is act with great respect during the time of the worship, when it's been set apart and designated as a worship time. Now, in these rules of respect, we're going to have to define them. The New Testament doesn't give them to us, and so we've got to create them for ourselves. And that's the tricky part of the equation. What do we say is respectful and disrespectful? Start with the principle of respect for the sacred, and then figure out what you're going to define as what respect looks like. Now keep this in mind, the application of the principle will vary significantly, because sanctuary rules have to be defined for each location by the people who actually use that sanctuary, the ones who actually have ownership of it. In other words, I don't define what is respectful in your place, nor do you define it in my place. My church figures out what's respectful here. That's why the rules are going to vary. Fact is, they've always been like that. The sanctuary rules have varied throughout church history, and they vary from culture to culture, from place to place. And I think rightly so. For example, what if we come up with a rule like no running in the sanctuary? You know, that makes perfect sense, perhaps in a fancy church building with a nice fancy sanctuary. Not so much sense when you're meeting in a gymnasium or a family life center and services are now over and adults are standing around and talking and fellowshipping, kids running, not as big a deal in a situation like that. Or how about a rule that says no drinks in the sanctuary, no coffee? Once again, it depends on the priorities that you're working with. Are you trying to keep from creating a mess? You don't want to stain the carpet? A rule like that makes sense. On the other hand, if you're trying to be warm and inviting and engaging a spirit of fellowship for people, you may decide, we'll clean up the mess. How about this rule? No eating in the sanctuary, no meals. Once again, it depends on how each group wants to take the limited space you have and use it for all the things you do. And that's where you'll decide, is it appropriate or not appropriate to multi-use a space like a sanctuary? You know, I think about Romans 14, and I got to remind you what Paul said there about traditions, about opinions, applies to all the things you and I are considering when we talk about respect for the sacred. It applies to respect for the sacred place. First, I advise you like Paul does. You got to use good common sense when you're creating rules for your church. Work towards a reasonable consensus that most of you can agree on. And you need to adapt and revise your tradition as needed. And over time, you will make changes. Don't feel bad about that. We create the traditions. We can change our own traditions. Also, do not judge the opinions and traditions that differ from your own. You may think yours is the best. That's okay. But don't judge others. Certainly don't raise your voice and let them know what you think. Keep it to yourself, Paul said in Romans 14. When you're visiting someone else's sanctuary space, follow their rules. You're the visitor on their turf. Play with their rules. That's what you'd want them to do if they came to your church. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. When you're visiting someone else's sanctuary, follow your conscience. If your mind has stricter rules than what they're using here, go ahead and follow your rules. And if they say, oh no, go ahead, you can do it, say, no, thank you, I'd rather not. And keep this in mind. If worst comes to worst, and you're not happy with the rules of sanctuary that you're seeing, either where you're visiting or in your home church, try to learn how to ignore everybody else and concentrate on getting your heart and your mind in tune with God. Because that's what you came here for in the first place. You came to worship God. Focus on Him, and I think you can enjoy a great time of worship.